73%. That's the number everyone throws around when they want to talk about what's wrong with black families in America. Politicians cite it, news anchors repeat it, social media debates explode over it. But here's what nobody ever asks. Where did that number actually come from? And I'm not talking about which research study or census data. I'm talking about the 400 years of deliberate, systematic destruction that created the conditions for that statistic to exist in the first place. See, numbers don't just appear out of thin air. They're built, brick by brick, policy by policy, generation by generation. And this particular number, it's got a foundation that starts with chains and auction blocks and runs all the way through to modern-day prison cells and welfare offices. Here's the truth that makes people uncomfortable. American institutions didn't just fail black families. They were specifically designed to tear them apart. And then, after centuries of that destruction, society turned around and asked, why can't they keep their families together? It's like burning someone's house down and then criticizing them for being homeless. Today we're going to walk through that burning, step by step, era by era, policy by policy. We're connecting dots that span from 1619 to right now. And by the time we're done, you'll understand that 73% isn't a statistic about morality or culture. It's a receipt. It's a bill for 4 centuries of systemic devastation. And if we're ever going to move forward, we need to stop treating the symptoms and start understanding the disease. So let's start by actually understanding what that 73% figure really means, because most people who quote it don't even know what they're talking about. This statistic comes from birth certificate data that shows approximately 73% of black children are born to unmarried mothers. Now, immediately people hear that and assume it means 73% of black kids grow up without fathers, which is absolutely not what the data says. Being unmarried at the time of birth doesn't mean the father isn't present, isn't involved, or isn't living in the same household. In fact, research shows that many unmarried black fathers are actively co-parenting and living with their children. But that nuance gets lost when people want to use this number as a weapon in culture war debates. Here's where it gets interesting, though. If you look back historically, this number wasn't always this high. In 1960, only about 20% of black children were born to unmarried mothers. That's right. Just 65 years ago, this figure was less than a third of what it is today. Go back even further to 1940, and you'll find that black marriage rates were actually comparable to white marriage rates, and in some demographics, even higher. Black families, despite living under the brutal oppression of Jim Crow, were forming 2-parent households at rates that would shock people today, who think this has always been the norm in the black community. But here's what changed between then and now, and this is critical to understand. The 73% statistic isn't measuring some inherent cultural trait or moral decline. It's measuring the cumulative effect of specific policies, economic shifts, and social disruptions that accelerated dramatically in the second half of the 20th century. We're talking about mass incarceration that exploded in the 1970s and 80s, removing millions of black men from their communities. We're talking about deindustrialization that eliminated the stable manufacturing jobs that had allowed black men to support families. We're talking about welfare policies that literally penalized 2-parent households by cutting off benefits if a father was present in the home. The number also needs context when you compare it to other communities. Yes, 73% is high, but the rate for white Americans has also climbed dramatically to around 29%, and for Hispanic Americans, it's around 53%. The entire country has seen a shift away from marriage before childbirth, but the black community's numbers are more extreme because they're dealing with more extreme pressures. When you layer economic devastation on top of mass incarceration, on top of housing discrimination, on top of educational inequality, you create conditions where traditional family formation becomes exponentially harder. So, before we go any further, lock this in your mind. The 73% statistic is a symptom, not a cause. It's the end result of a long historical process that we're about to unpack. And that process, it starts long before 1960, long before the Civil Rights Movement, long before the 20th century even began. To really understand this number, we've got to go back to the very beginning, to the moment when black family structures in America were first systematically destroyed. The destruction didn't start with welfare policies or war on drugs legislation. It started on the shores of West Africa, in the hull of slave ships, and on auction blocks across the American South. If you want to understand why black family structures look the way they do today, you have to start with the fact that for 246 years, black families in America had no legal right to exist. Think about that for a moment. Not just that families were struggling or facing hardship, but that the entire legal and economic system of slavery was built on the principle that black families could not and should not be recognized as legitimate family units at all. Under slavery, marriages between enslaved people had absolutely no legal standing. A man and woman could love each other, commit to each other, have children together, and build a life as much as their brutal circumstances allowed, but in the eyes of the law, they were not a family. They were property, and property doesn't have family rights. This wasn't an accidental oversight or some minor technicality. It was deliberately structured this way because recognizing slave families as legitimate would have undermined the entire economic foundation of slavery. If enslaved people had legally recognized families, it would have been much harder to justify selling a man away from his wife or a mother away from her children. The denial of family rights was essential to keeping the system running smoothly. Slave owners had complete authority to separate families whenever it suited their economic interests. And trust me, it suited their interests often. When an owner died, enslaved families were divided up among heirs like furniture or livestock. When an owner faced financial difficulties, families were broken apart and sold to pay debts. When an owner simply decided they needed cash or wanted to punish someone, family separation was the tool they used. Historians estimate that between 1/3 to 1/2 of all slave marriages were destroyed by forced separation through sale. Let that sink in. If you were an enslaved person who married and had children, you had a coin flip's chance of watching your family be torn apart before your eyes. But it wasn't just about the immediate trauma of separation, as devastating as that was. The systematic destruction of families under slavery created a foundational disruption that would echo through generations. Enslaved people couldn't pass down property, couldn't build wealth, couldn't establish family names and lineages the way other Americans could. Children often grew up not knowing who their fathers were because men were sold away, or because slave owners sexually exploited enslaved women, and those children became part of the enslaved population. The entire structure of how families normally function, how they build stability across generations, how they accumulate resources and knowledge and pass them down, was deliberately and violently disrupted for nearly 2.5 centuries. What's particularly insidious is how this created patterns that would persist long after slavery ended. When you spend generations unable to legally protect your family, unable to make decisions about your children's future, unable to build any kind of family stability, those experiences create deep psychological and social wounds. The trauma of family separation became embedded in the collective memory of black communities. More than that, it meant that when freedom finally came in 1865, formerly enslaved people had no template, no resources, no institutional support for building the kind of stable family structures that other Americans had been developing for generations. They had to start from absolute zero, and as we'll see, the country wasn't about to give them the tools or space to rebuild what had been stolen from them. This is where the 73% really begins. Not in the 1960s or 70s, but in those 246 years when the very concept of a black family was treated as legally impossible and economically inconvenient. Every generation that followed would be building on a foundation that had been shattered before it was ever laid. And if you think slavery was bad, wait until you hear about what came immediately after, because in some ways, the betrayal that followed emancipation cut even deeper. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. But we need to get even more specific about what that family destruction actually looked like on the ground. Because when we talk about slavery breaking up families, it's easy for that to become just another abstract historical fact. The reality was far more brutal and personal than most people understand. Slave auctions weren't just economic transactions. They were theaters of horror where human beings watched their entire worlds collapse in real time. And the psychological devastation of those moments rippled forward through generations in ways we're still dealing with today. Imagine being a mother standing on an auction block, holding your 3-year-old daughter's hand, knowing that in the next few minutes, someone is going to buy one of you and not the other. You're trying to memorize every detail of your child's face because you understand this might be the last time you ever see her. She's confused, crying, asking you what's happening, and you don't even have words to explain it, because how do you tell a 3-year-old that the world is this cruel? Then the auctioneer separates you, and you watch as strange hands pull your daughter away. You scream her name. She screams for you. And then she's gone. You don't know where she's going. You don't know if she'll be fed, if she'll be beaten, if she'll even survive. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering, and you'll never get an answer. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This was normal. This was Tuesday afternoon in Charleston or New Orleans or Richmond. The slave trade created what researchers now recognize as a form of complex trauma that affected not just individuals, but entire communities across multiple generations. When we talk about generational trauma, we're talking about how the psychological wounds of one generation get passed down to the next, not just through stories and memories, but through actual changes in how families function, how people relate to each other, and even how stress responses get encoded in the body. Modern neuroscience has shown that severe trauma can actually affect gene expression in ways that influence the next generation's stress responses and emotional regulation. The descendants of people who experienced the constant threat of family separation grew up in households shaped by that terror, even if they themselves weren't directly separated. Think about what it meant to be a child who grew up watching adults around you live in constant fear that their loved ones could be ripped away at any moment. You learned that attachment was dangerous. You learned that loving someone deeply meant setting yourself up for unbearable pain. You learned that the world was fundamentally unstable and that no amount of love or commitment could protect your family. These lessons didn't just disappear when slavery ended. They became part of how communities understood relationships and family bonds. Some historians argue that certain relational patterns in Black communities, including sometimes maintaining emotional distance as a protection mechanism, or having extended family networks rather than relying solely on nuclear family units, can be traced back to adaptive strategies that developed in response to the constant threat of forced separation. The auction block also created specific gendered trauma that affected how men and women related to each other for generations afterward. Enslaved men were forced to watch their wives and children sold away while being completely powerless to protect them. That emasculation, that stripping away of the traditional role of protector and provider, created deep psychological wounds around masculinity and fatherhood. Enslaved women were forced into impossible positions where their children could be taken from them at any moment, creating a form of maternal trauma where the fundamental bond between mother and child was always under threat. Both of these traumas shaped gender dynamics and family roles in ways that persisted long after slavery ended. What makes this particularly relevant to our 73% statistic is understanding that these weren't just individual tragedies. They were systematic disruptions that prevented the development of stable family formation patterns across an entire population. When you can't count on being able to stay with your family, when marriage has no legal protection, when your children might be sold before they reach adolescence, you don't develop the same multi-generational patterns of family stability that other communities take for granted. You can't pass down lessons about how to build lasting marriages when your own marriage was destroyed by force. You can't teach your children about family stability when you grew up in chaos. The auction block didn't just separate individual families in the moment. It severed the transmission of family-building knowledge and patterns across entire generations, and that severance created a void that would prove nearly impossible to fill in the years that followed. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, and the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery in 1865, you might think this was the moment when Black families could finally start rebuilding what had been destroyed. Freedom at last, right? The chance to finally form stable households, reunite separated families, and build the kind of generational wealth and stability that had been denied for nearly 2.5 centuries. But here's the cruel twist that nobody talks about enough. Freedom without resources isn't really freedom at all. It's abandonment with a different name. 4 million formerly enslaved people were released into a society with nothing. No land, no money, no education, no tools, no homes. Just freedom on paper and a country that was absolutely determined to make sure that paper promise never translated into actual economic or social power. The immediate aftermath of emancipation revealed just how hollow freedom could be when it wasn't backed up with material support. There was brief hope during Reconstruction when the federal government seemed committed to helping formerly enslaved people establish themselves as full citizens. Some families did manage to reunite after years or decades of separation, with people walking hundreds of miles searching for children, spouses, and parents who had been sold away. Newspapers from that era are filled with ads from people desperately seeking information about lost family members. But reunion was only the first step, and it was the easiest part compared to what came next. How do you build a stable household when you have absolutely nothing to build it with? How do you provide for your children when you've been denied education, when you own no property, when the only skill you have is agricultural labor that you were forced to perform under slavery? This is where sharecropping entered the picture, and it might be one of the most insidious systems ever created because it looked like opportunity but functioned as economic slavery with a different name. Here's how it worked. Formerly enslaved people who had no land would make agreements with white landowners to farm portions of their property. In exchange for their labor, they'd receive a share of the crop they produced. Sounds reasonable enough on the surface, right? But the system was rigged from the start. Sharecroppers had to rent everything from the landowner: tools, seeds, housing, food for their families, while they waited for harvest. The landowner kept all the books and determined the value of everything. By the time harvest came, sharecroppers would find themselves owing more to the landowner than their share of the crop was worth. They'd end up in debt, legally bound to stay on that land until the debt was paid off, which it never was because the system was designed to keep them perpetually indebted. What this meant for family formation was devastating in ways that directly connect to our present day. A man couldn't really be the provider and protector of his family when he was trapped in a system that guaranteed he'd never earn enough to support them. Fathers were working from sunup to sundown in the same fields where they'd been enslaved, except now they were going deeper into debt every year instead of building anything for their children's future. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. These were men who had survived slavery, who had dreamed of freedom as the moment they could finally be real fathers and husbands, and instead they found themselves in a system that was almost designed to prove they couldn't provide for their families. That sense of emasculation, that feeling of being unable to fulfill the traditional male role despite working harder than almost anyone, created wounds that affected how multiple generations of black men would understand their place in their families and communities. Women faced equally impossible situations. Many formerly enslaved women tried to leave agricultural labor because it was associated with slavery and because they wanted to focus on their own households rather than working in white people's fields. But economic necessity forced most back into labor, either as sharecroppers alongside their husbands or as domestic workers in white homes. This meant black mothers were often raising white children while struggling to find time to care for their own. The pattern of black women working outside their homes out of economic necessity rather than choice, which would persist through the 20th century and into today, started here in these post-emancipation decades. It wasn't a cultural preference. It was economic survival in a system that refused to pay black men enough to support their families alone. The failure of Reconstruction to provide formerly enslaved people with real economic foundation, the famous promise of 40 acres, and a mule that never materialized for most, meant that the family disruption of slavery wasn't followed by family restoration. Instead, it was followed by a different kind of disruption, one that was economic rather than physical, but almost as destructive to family stability. You can't build stable multi-generational families when you're trapped in poverty, when you can't accumulate any wealth, when your children have no better prospects than you did. The 73% statistic has roots in this moment, in the broken promise of emancipation, in the transformation of physical chains into economic ones that were just as effective at preventing black families from achieving the stability that other American families were building during this same period. If sharecropping was the economic trap that kept black families in poverty after emancipation, Jim Crow was the legal fortress that made sure they could never escape it. Starting in the 1880s and 1890s, And lasting all the way until the 1960s, the American South constructed the most comprehensive system of racial oppression ever codified into law in this country. And here's what's crucial to understand about Jim Crow in relation to our topic. These weren't just laws about where black people could sit on a bus or which water fountain they could drink from. They were laws specifically designed to prevent black men from being able to fulfill the role of provider and protector, and to prevent black families from achieving any kind of economic stability that might threaten white supremacy. Every aspect of Jim Crow, when you really examine it, was about making sure black families couldn't function the way white families did. Let's start with employment discrimination, because this is where Jim Crow directly attacked black men's ability to support their families. Across the South, laws and customs reserved the best jobs exclusively for white men. Black men were systematically locked out of skilled trades, professional positions, and any employment that paid enough to comfortably support a family. Even when black men had skills, trade unions which controlled access to good jobs refused to admit them. When black workers tried to organize their own unions or demand fair wages, they faced violence and legal persecution. The result was that black men, no matter how hard they worked, no matter how talented or educated they were, hit a ceiling that kept them in poverty. This created a situation where marriage became economically difficult because a man couldn't offer his potential wife and future children the kind of financial security that society said a husband should provide. When you can't be a provider in a society that defines manhood by providing, it affects how you see yourself and how potential partners see you. But Jim Crow went even further by criminalizing normal black existence in ways that tore men away from their families. Vagrancy laws made it illegal to be unemployed, but black men were systematically denied employment. Loitering laws made it illegal to stand around in public, giving police justification to arrest black men for essentially existing. Once arrested, black men were funneled into convict leasing programs where they were literally rented out to plantations, mines, and factories to work in conditions that were often more deadly than slavery had been. A man could be arrested for something as minor as not stepping off the sidewalk fast enough when a white person approached, and then disappear into the convict leasing system for months or years. His family left with no support and no idea when or if he'd return. This was slavery by another name, and it accomplished the same goal of family separation that slavery had, just with legal paperwork instead of auction blocks. Education was another critical way Jim Crow undermined black families across generations. Southern states spent dramatically less money on black schools than white schools, sometimes as little as 1/10 the funding per student. Black schools got the oldest textbooks, the worst buildings, the shortest school years, because black children were expected to work during planting and harvest seasons. Teachers in black schools were paid far less than their white counterparts. The entire system was designed to ensure that black children received just enough education to be functional workers, but not enough to compete with white workers or aspire to professional careers. This created a cycle where parents who had been denied education couldn't help their children access better education, which meant the next generation faced the same employment discrimination their parents had faced. Family advancement across generations, which is how most American families built themselves into the middle class, was structurally impossible under Jim Crow. The psychological warfare of Jim Crow also damaged family structures in ways that are harder to measure, but just as real. Black men were forced to accept daily humiliation, to step aside for white people, to endure insults and degradation without response because any assertion of dignity could result in violence or death. Fathers had to teach their sons survival strategies that involved accepting disrespect and inferiority. Mothers had to send their children into a world designed to crush their spirits. The ritual humiliations of segregation, having to use separate and inferior facilities, being unable to try on clothes in stores or eat in restaurants, being addressed as boy or by first name regardless of age, while having to call white children Mr. or Miss. All of this created a psychological burden that families carried home with them. You can't maintain healthy family dynamics when the outside world is constantly attacking your dignity and your ability to protect and provide for your loved ones. What connects Jim Crow to that 73% statistic is understanding that for nearly 80 years, the law itself worked against black family formation and stability. This wasn't economic hardship that anyone could eventually overcome through hard work. This was the full force of the law, backed by violence, specifically structured to make stable two-parent households economically unfeasible for millions of Black Americans. And when Jim Crow finally ended in the 1960s, the damage didn't magically disappear. Multiple generations had grown up under a system that prevented normal family formation patterns, and those generations had to somehow figure out how to build stable families without the economic foundation, educational opportunities, or accumulated wealth that other families had been building while Jim Crow held Black families down. Then came what historians call the Great Migration, and on the surface, it looked like the solution to everything Jim Crow had created. Starting around 1910 and continuing through the 1970s, roughly 6 million Black Americans left the South, heading north and west to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. They were chasing the promise of industrial jobs that paid real wages, escaping the terrorism of lynching and the suffocation of segregation, seeking places where their children might actually have a future. And in many ways, the Great Migration did offer genuine opportunities that the South never would have provided. Black families who made it north often found better jobs, better schools, and more freedom than they'd ever known. But here's the complexity that gets lost in the triumphant narrative of the Great Migration. The very act of moving, of leaving everything behind to chase opportunity hundreds or thousands of miles away, created new forms of family disruption that would have lasting consequences. Migration rarely happened as neat family units all moving together. The economic reality meant that usually one person, most often a man, would go first to establish himself in the new city, find work, find housing, and then eventually send for his family. But that process could take months or years, and during that time, families were split between South and North, connected only by letters and occasional visits if they could afford the train fare. Sometimes men went north with every intention of bringing their families, but found the northern cities far more expensive and unwelcoming than they had imagined. The good industrial jobs were often seasonal or unstable. Housing discrimination meant Black families were crammed into overcrowded neighborhoods paying inflated rent, and the promise of the North started looking more complicated than the dream had suggested. Some men did bring their families north successfully, but others found themselves unable to establish the stable foundation they had hoped for, and the temporary separation became permanent, not always by choice, but by circumstance. The migration also shattered the extended family networks that had been one of the few sources of stability Black families had maintained despite slavery, sharecropping, and Jim Crow. In the South, even under terrible conditions, families often lived near grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, creating support systems where childcare was shared, where wisdom was passed down, where struggling families could lean on relatives when times got hard. These kinship networks had been absolutely crucial to survival, but when families migrated north, they often left those networks behind. A young mother in Chicago dealing with a husband working double shifts in a factory, living in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood where she knew no one, didn't have her mother or grandmother or sister nearby to help raise her children the way previous generations had. The village that had helped raise Black children in the South didn't exist in these northern cities, at least not initially, and it took years or generations for new community networks to form. Northern cities also presented new challenges to family stability that rural Southern life hadn't prepared people for. The industrial economy was brutal and unstable, with layoffs and plant closures that could devastate a family overnight. The cost of living was dramatically higher, making it harder for one income to support a family. The urban environment itself, with its anonymity and faster pace, created different social dynamics than the small Southern communities where everyone knew everyone, and social pressure helped maintain certain norms and behaviors. Young people in northern cities had more freedom, more temptation, and less community oversight than they had had in the South. This wasn't necessarily bad, but it did mean that some of the informal systems that had supported family stability in the South didn't translate to northern urban life. The Great Migration also coincided with massive changes in American industry that would eventually devastate the very communities Black migrants were building. The good factory jobs that brought black families north in the 1940s and 50s started disappearing in the 1970s and 80s as manufacturing moved overseas or became automated. Black workers who had finally gained access to middle-class incomes through industrial labor suddenly found themselves laid off with skills that were no longer valuable in the new economy. Entire neighborhoods that had been built around factory work collapsed economically, and the family stability that had been constructed during the good years crumbled along with the economic foundation that supported it. The migration that had seemed like an escape from Southern oppression led black families into northern cities just in time to experience deindustrialization, white flight, and urban decay. What connects the Great Migration to our 73% statistic is understanding that geographic mobility, even when it's driven by the search for better opportunities, can disrupt family formation patterns in ways that take generations to stabilize. The migration didn't cause family breakdown in any simple way, but it did create conditions of instability, separation of extended families, and economic uncertainty that made maintaining stable two-parent households more challenging. And just as these migrant communities were starting to establish themselves and build new support systems in northern cities, they got hit with the next wave of destructive policies that we're about to discuss. While black families were moving north, searching for opportunity, the federal government was simultaneously constructing one of the most devastating wealth destruction machines ever created in America, and most people have never even heard of it. It's called redlining, and if you want to understand why black families today have roughly 1/10 the wealth of white families, why stable home ownership has been so elusive in black communities, and how housing policy directly undermined family formation, you need to understand what happened starting in the 1930s and continuing for decades afterward. This wasn't some accidental policy failure or unintended consequence. This was the United States government officially designating black neighborhoods as hazardous investments and systematically denying black families access to the primary way American families build wealth: home ownership. Here's how it worked. In 1933, during the Great Depression, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation to help Americans buy homes by providing government-backed mortgages with low interest rates and long repayment terms. This was revolutionary because it made home ownership accessible to working and middle-class families who previously couldn't afford it. But there was a catch that would prove catastrophic for black families. The government created maps of American cities, color-coding neighborhoods based on their perceived investment risk. Neighborhoods with significant black populations, and in many cases, neighborhoods with even a single black family, were outlined in red and marked as hazardous. Banks wouldn't provide mortgages in these redlined areas, which meant black families were systematically denied access to government-backed home loans, even when they had stable incomes and good credit. Meanwhile, white families were able to buy homes in green and blue-coded neighborhoods with government assistance, beginning their journey toward building generational wealth through home equity. The impact on family stability was immediate and profound. Home ownership does something psychologically and practically that renting can never do. When you own your home, you have stability and control over your living situation that creates a foundation for everything else in family life. You can put down roots in a community, establish relationships with neighbors, get your children into schools knowing they won't have to move mid-year because a landlord decided to sell or raise the rent. You build equity that becomes an asset you can borrow against during emergencies or use to fund your children's education. You have something tangible to pass down to the next generation, giving them a head start that you never had. White families were building all of this during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, while black families were locked out, forced to remain renters in neighborhoods that were systematically disinvested and allowed to deteriorate. Redlining also created a vicious cycle that compounded over time. Because banks wouldn't invest in black neighborhoods, those areas received no capital for maintenance, no renovation, or business development. Buildings fell into disrepair because landlords knew they could rent to black families who had no other options and therefore didn't need to maintain properties. Grocery stores, quality retailers, and other businesses either left these neighborhoods or never arrived in the first place because they couldn't get loans to operate there. Schools in redline neighborhoods received less funding because they were based on property taxes, and properties in redlined areas were worth less by design. The neighborhoods where black families were forced to live became exactly the kind of unstable, under-resourced environments that make maintaining stable family structures incredibly difficult. The relationship between housing and family formation is direct and powerful. When a young couple considers getting married and starting a family, one of their primary considerations is whether they can provide a stable home environment for children. If home ownership is impossible, if you're perpetually at the mercy of landlords, if the neighborhoods where you can afford to live are deteriorating and unsafe, that calculus changes. Some couples delay marriage or childbearing, waiting for stability that never comes. Others have children without the married stable household they would have preferred, because they realize that stability isn't going to materialize no matter how long they wait. The housing discrimination embedded in redlining didn't just prevent wealth accumulation. It actively disrupted the normal progression of courtship, marriage, and family formation that other Americans were experiencing during the same decades. What makes redlining particularly insidious in our story is its timing. Just as black families were escaping Jim Crow and establishing themselves in northern and western cities, just as they were finally accessing industrial jobs that paid enough to support families, the federal government ensured they couldn't translate those incomes into the home ownership that would have stabilized their communities and families across generations. White families who earned the same incomes were buying homes in suburbs that would appreciate enormously in value over the following decades. Black families earning the same incomes were trapped in redlined urban neighborhoods that would decline in value, concentrating poverty and all its associated problems in exactly the places where black families were trying to build their lives. By the time redlining was officially outlawed in 1968, multiple generations of black families had been denied the opportunity to build home equity, creating a wealth gap that persists to this day and continues to affect family stability in black communities. Now, let's zoom in on something that ties all of these historical threads together and brings us closer to understanding that 73% statistic: what happened to black men's ability to work and provide for families. Because when you stack up centuries of slavery that denied black men any economic autonomy, followed by sharecropping that trapped them in debt, followed by Jim Crow that locked them out of good jobs, followed by migration that disrupted their communities, followed by redlining that prevented wealth building, you arrive at the mid-20th century with black men facing employment discrimination so severe and systematic that it fundamentally altered family formation patterns. This isn't about individual failures or cultural problems. This is about an economic system that was structurally designed to ensure black men couldn't fulfill the traditional breadwinner role that society simultaneously demanded of them. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because they tell a story that explanations alone can't capture. In 1954, black men and white men had nearly identical labor force participation rates, both hovering around 85%. Both groups of men were working at roughly the same rates. But then something dramatic happened over the next few decades. By 1980, while white male labor force participation had declined slightly to around 77%, black male labor force participation had plummeted to 67%. By 2000, it had fallen even further. We're talking about millions of black men who wanted to work, who needed to work, but who were systematically locked out of the labor market. And here's the critical connection. This collapse in black male employment corresponds almost exactly with the rise in single-parent households in black communities. When men can't find stable work, marriage rates decline and non-marital births increase. It's not complicated sociology. It's basic economics meeting human nature. The discrimination black men faced in employment wasn't subtle or accidental. Study after study from the 1960s onward showed that black men with identical qualifications to white men were far less likely to be hired, and when they were hired, they were paid less and promoted less frequently. One famous study sent out identical resumes to employers, with the only difference being names that suggested race. Resumes with stereotypically white names like Greg or Emily received 50% more callbacks than identical resumes with stereotypically black names like Jamal or Lakeisha. Black men also faced what researchers call the criminal record penalty multiplier, where having any interaction with the criminal justice system, even arrests that didn't lead to convictions, created permanent employment barriers that white men with identical records didn't experience to the same degree. The labor market wasn't just difficult for black men, it was actively hostile in ways that made stable employment, the foundation of family formation, extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Deindustrialization hit black men particularly hard because they had only recently gained access to manufacturing jobs that paid middle-class wages. Remember, black workers were the last hired into these industrial positions, only really accessing them in significant numbers during and after World War II, when labor shortages forced factories to hire black workers they had previously excluded. Just as black men were establishing themselves in auto plants, steel mills, and other manufacturing facilities, those industries began their long decline. Factories closed or moved overseas. Automation eliminated jobs. The industrial Midwest transformed into the Rust Belt. Black men who had finally found stable work that could support families suddenly found themselves unemployed with skills that were no longer valuable. The service economy that replaced manufacturing offered plenty of low-wage jobs, but far fewer positions that paid enough to support a family on a single income. The psychological impact of chronic unemployment and underemployment on black men cannot be overstated. Marriage in American society has traditionally been tied to male economic provision. A man was expected to be able to support a wife and children before marriage was considered appropriate. When black men faced unemployment rates that were consistently double those of white men, when the jobs available to them paid poverty wages, many felt they couldn't responsibly marry and have children because they couldn't fulfill that provider role. Some chose not to marry even when they had children because they felt they'd failed as men if they couldn't financially support their families. Women making these partnership decisions also had to consider economic reality. If a potential husband can't find stable work, if his presence in the household might actually jeopardize welfare benefits that are keeping children fed, the calculation about marriage changes dramatically. This isn't about not valuing marriage or family. It's about economic survival in a system that made traditional family formation economically irrational for many black couples. What we're seeing in that 73% statistic is partly the accumulated effect of generations of employment discrimination against black men. When society simultaneously demands that men be economic providers and then systematically denies black men access to jobs that would allow them to provide, you create conditions where traditional two-parent households become difficult to form and maintain. The statistic isn't measuring moral failure. It's measuring the predictable outcome of centuries of economic exclusion. And just when you might think things couldn't get worse, the government stepped in with policies that would make everything dramatically worse, starting with a report that would define the debate for decades to come. Right in the middle of the civil rights movement, when black Americans were finally making legal and political gains after centuries of oppression, a document emerged from the federal government that would shape and poison discussions about black families for the next 60 years. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was serving as Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Lyndon Johnson, released a report titled The Negro Family: The Case for National Action. This report, which became known simply as the Moynihan Report, observed that black families were increasingly headed by single mothers and argued that this represented a crisis that was holding back black progress. Now, Moynihan wasn't entirely wrong in his observations, and to be fair to him, he was actually trying to argue for more government intervention to help black families. But the way he framed the issue, and more importantly, the way his report was interpreted and weaponized by others, turned what could have been a conversation about structural solutions into a decades-long blame game that focused on black family pathology, while ignoring the centuries of systematic destruction we've been discussing. Here's where Moynihan went wrong and why this matters for understanding how we talk about that 73% statistic even today. The report identified the rise in black single-mother households as the fundamental problem, calling it a tangle of pathology that was self-perpetuating. He argued that black families had been damaged by slavery and discrimination, which was true, but then suggested that black family structure itself had become the primary obstacle to progress, essentially arguing that the victim had become the problem. The report spent far more time documenting family structure issues than it did analyzing the ongoing employment discrimination, housing segregation, educational inequality, and all the other structural barriers that were actively preventing black family stability at that very moment. It was like examining someone who's been shot and spending your entire medical report discussing how their bleeding is the real problem while barely mentioning the bullet or the person who fired the gun. The timing of this report was particularly damaging because it landed right when America was being forced to confront its racism through the civil rights movement. White Americans who were uncomfortable with the demands for equality and the disruption of protests suddenly had an official government document they could point to that seemed to say the real problem was black family dysfunction, not white racism or structural inequality. Politicians, particularly conservative ones, seized on the report to argue against expanded social programs, claiming that the issue wasn't discrimination or lack of opportunity, but rather the breakdown of black families, which they implied was a cultural or moral problem rather than a structural one. The report gave intellectual cover to people who wanted to believe that poverty and struggle in black communities was self-inflicted rather than systematically imposed. What makes the Moynihan Report so frustrating is that it could have been a turning point towards serious structural interventions. Moynihan himself actually called for massive government programs to address black male unemployment, saying the federal government should become the employer of last resort if necessary to ensure black men could find work and support families. He recognized that employment discrimination was crushing black families, but that part of his argument got lost almost immediately. What stuck was the language about pathology, about family breakdown, about black families being fundamentally damaged. The structural recommendations were ignored, while the pathological framing became the dominant narrative. Instead of America responding to the report by saying we need to fix the employment discrimination and housing segregation that's making stable black families so difficult to maintain, the response became we need to fix black families, as if the families themselves were defective rather than responding rationally to impossible circumstances. The legacy of the Moynihan Report lives on in every conversation about black families where someone brings up single motherhood, as if it's the cause rather than the symptom. It lives on in every political speech that talks about personal responsibility and cultural problems, without mentioning redlining or mass incarceration or employment discrimination. It lives on in the assumption that if 73% of black children are born to unmarried mothers, the problem must be with black people's values or choices rather than with the system that spent 400 years making traditional family formation nearly impossible and then spent another 60 years refusing to create the economic conditions that would support it. The report essentially medicalized black family structure, treating it as a pathology to be cured rather than as an adaptation to structural violence that needed to be addressed at its roots. What happened immediately after the Moynihan Report makes its legacy even more problematic. Rather than the massive employment programs and anti-discrimination enforcement Moynihan called for, what black families got was an expansion of welfare programs that, as we're about to see, were structured in ways that actually discouraged two-parent households. The conversation shifted from how do we fix the systems that are destroying black families to how do we manage the social problems created by broken black families. It was a fundamental misdirection that allowed the real structural issues to continue unchallenged, while black families were pathologized for responding to those structures in predictable ways. And nowhere was this misdirection more damaging than in the welfare policies that followed, policies that were supposedly designed to help families but actually ended up tearing them apart. So, America had just received the Moynihan Report documenting rising single parenthood in black communities, and President Lyndon Johnson had launched his ambitious war on poverty with programs designed to help struggling families escape destitution. On paper, this should have been the moment when government finally stepped in to provide the support that could help stabilize black families after centuries of systematic destruction. Programs like aid to families with dependent children, food stamps, Medicaid, and housing assistance were supposed to catch families before they fell into desperate poverty. These weren't handouts or charity in the negative sense that critics would later claim. These were recognitions that after slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow, employment discrimination, and housing segregation, many families needed help to get on stable footing. But here's the tragedy that nobody talks about enough. The very programs designed to help poor families were structured with rules that actively punish marriage and incentivize family separation. The government essentially told struggling black families that they could receive help, but only if fathers weren't present in the home. Let me explain how this worked because the mechanism is important for understanding how well-intentioned policy created perverse outcomes. Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which was the primary cash assistance program, had a rule that families could only receive benefits if there was no able-bodied man in the household. The logic behind this rule was rooted in outdated assumptions that any household with a man present should be able to support itself through his employment. So, government assistance was only necessary for households headed by women alone. But remember everything we just discussed about black male unemployment, about systematic job discrimination, about deindustrialization, eliminating the manufacturing jobs black men had finally accessed. Black men weren't absent from the labor market because they were lazy or irresponsible. They were absent because the labor market was systematically excluding them. Yet welfare policy was written as if good jobs were readily available to any man who wanted to work, which was absolutely not the reality black men faced. Here's where it gets truly perverse. A black family struggling with poverty faced an impossible choice. If the father remained in the household, the family would be ineligible for welfare benefits, food stamps, and potentially subsidized housing. If the father left, at least officially, the mother could access these benefits and keep the children fed and housed. Now, imagine being a father in this situation. You love your children. You want to be there for them. But you can't find stable employment because of discrimination. And your presence in the home is literally making your children worse off economically because it's disqualifying them from assistance that could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. What do? Some fathers made the agonizing decision to leave, or to at least officially separate so their families could access benefits, even if they tried to remain involved unofficially. This wasn't abandonment in the moral sense. This was sacrifice in an impossible situation created by policy that forced families to choose between father presence and economic survival. The system also created what economists call a marriage penalty that made legal marriage economically irrational for many poor couples. A single mother receiving welfare benefits who married an employed man would lose those benefits, but his income often wasn't enough to replace what the benefits had provided, especially once you factored in the loss of Medicaid coverage. The couple would actually be worse off married than they were when the mother was single and receiving assistance. Young couples who might have otherwise married before or shortly after having children looked at this calculation and realized that marriage would make them poorer. This wasn't a rejection of marriage as an institution or a cultural devaluation of family. This was a rational economic response to policy that literally punished marriage with financial penalties that struggling families couldn't afford to pay. What makes these welfare policies particularly damaging is that they operated during the exact decades, the 1960s through the 1990s, when the 73% statistic was developing. These were the years when black single parenthood went from being relatively unusual to becoming the majority pattern. And during these same years, government policy was actively making it financially difficult for poor black families to maintain two-parent households. You had systematic employment discrimination, keeping black men out of good jobs. You had welfare rules that penalized their presence in households. And you had a combination of forces essentially telling black families that the father's economic contribution was less valuable than his absence, which would qualify the family for government benefits. The policy didn't force fathers to leave, but it certainly created powerful incentives pointing in that direction. The architects of these welfare policies weren't sitting in rooms deliberately trying to destroy black families. Most believed they were helping. But they designed programs based on assumptions about male employment and family economics that didn't reflect the reality black families faced. They assumed any able-bodied man could find work that would support a family, which wasn't true for black men facing discrimination. They assumed that requiring men to be absent would be a temporary situation until the men found work, not recognizing that structural barriers might keep men unemployed or underemployed indefinitely. And critically, they never seemed to consider that the rules themselves might change behavior, that telling families you'll help them only if fathers aren't present might actually result in more fathers being absent, not because they didn't care about their children, but because the system made their absence economically necessary for their children's survival. These policies took families that were already struggling because of centuries of oppression and forced them into an impossible choice between father presence and economic security. And then society turned around and blamed black families for making the rational choice the policies incentivized. Just when black families were navigating the impossible economics of welfare policies that penalized father presence, America launched what would become the most devastating assault on black families since slavery itself: mass incarceration. Starting in the early 1970s and accelerating dramatically through the 80s and 90s, the United States began imprisoning people at rates never before seen in any democratic society in human history. And while this explosion of imprisonment affected Americans across all races, it fell on black communities with such disproportionate force that it functionally became a system of family destruction, targeting black fathers specifically. If you want to understand that 73% statistic, if you want to know why so many black children grow up without their fathers present, you cannot ignore the fact that America decided to lock up those fathers at rates that defy any reasonable justification based on actual crime rates or public safety needs. The numbers are so extreme that they almost don't seem real until you sit with them for a moment. In 1970, there were roughly 300,000 people in American prisons and jails. By 2000, that number had exploded to over 2 million, nearly a seven-fold increase in just 30 years. Black men bore the brunt of this increase in ways that are almost hard to comprehend. By the year 2000, 1 in 3 black men could expect to go to prison at some point in their lives, compared to 1 in 17 white men. In some urban neighborhoods, more than half of black men had been incarcerated by their mid-30s. We're not talking about career criminals or dangerous offenders exclusively. We're talking about massive numbers of arrests and imprisonments for nonviolent offenses, drug possession, parole violations, and other charges that previous generations might have handled with fines or probation if they were prosecuted at all. This wasn't crime creating incarceration. This was policy choices creating incarceration, and those policy choices targeted black communities with precision that looked almost intentional. The war on drugs, launched by President Nixon in 1971 and dramatically escalated by President Reagan in the 1980s, became the primary engine driving black men into prisons. Crack cocaine, which appeared in black urban neighborhoods in the mid-80s, was penalized 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine, even though they're pharmacologically nearly identical. The difference was that crack was associated with black users, while powder cocaine was associated with white users. A person caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine, an amount that fits in your palm, faced a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence. You'd need 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger that same sentence. This wasn't based on science or public health data. This was drug policy with racial targeting built into its DNA. Police were deployed into black neighborhoods to make drug arrests, even though data consistently showed that white Americans used and sold drugs at similar or higher rates. The difference was that white drug users were more likely to use and sell in private spaces like college dorms and suburban homes, while poverty and housing discrimination pushed black drug activity into public spaces, where it was more visible and easier for police to target. Think about what mass incarceration does to a family in immediate practical terms. A father gets arrested, often for something nonviolent like drug possession or a parole violation. He's held on bail he can't afford because he was already struggling economically. He loses his job because he can't show up to work while he's locked up. He eventually gets sentenced to several years in prison. While he's gone, his family loses whatever income he was contributing. His children grow up without him. His partner has to figure out how to raise children alone while also trying to work and keep the household together. When he finally gets out, he has a criminal record that makes employment nearly impossible because most employers won't hire people with felony convictions. He also might lose voting rights, access to public housing, eligibility for student loans, and numerous other civil rights and benefits. He essentially becomes a permanent second-class citizen, marked for life by his conviction, unable to fulfill the provider role that society says makes a man worthy of respect and family leadership. But the damage goes even deeper than the immediate family separation. Mass incarceration changed the entire social fabric of black communities in ways that made stable family formation structurally difficult, even for people who were never incarcerated themselves. In neighborhoods where a third or half of men have been to prison, the gender ratio gets dramatically skewed. There are simply more women than available men who haven't been incarcerated or who don't carry the stigma and employment barriers of a criminal record. This shifts relationship dynamics and reduces women's ability to be selective about partners because the pool of available men is artificially reduced by incarceration. It also normalizes father absence because when prison takes fathers away from so many families, growing up without a father becomes the expected norm rather than the exception, which changes how young people think about family formation and what they expect for their own futures. The parallels between mass incarceration and slavery in terms of family destruction are impossible to ignore. Both systems removed black men from their communities and families at massive scale. Both created legal justifications for treating black people as less than full citizens. Both generated enormous profits, whether from slave labor or from the prison industrial complex that includes private prisons, prison labor, and all the companies that service the incarceration system. And both left generations of black children growing up without their fathers, creating cycles of trauma and instability that ripple forward through time. When people ask why 73% of black children are born to unmarried parents, part of the answer is that America imprisoned the fathers at rates that made traditional family formation mathematically impossible in many communities. You can't maintain two-parent households when one parent is locked in a cage, and you can't build stable communities when a third of your men are cycling in and out of prisons. While all of these structural forces were tearing black families apart, through economic exclusion, discriminatory policies, and mass incarceration, another powerful system was simultaneously shaping how America understood and talked about black families. The media, television, film, news coverage, and later music videos created and reinforced stereotypes about black family dysfunction that became so deeply embedded in American consciousness that they're still shaping conversations today. These weren't just harmless entertainment or neutral reporting. These were narratives that justified the very policies destroying black families by making it seem like the destruction was self-inflicted, like black families were broken because of cultural or moral deficiencies, rather than because of centuries of systematic oppression. The media became a propaganda machine that blamed victims for their victimization while ignoring or minimizing the structural causes we've been discussing. Let's start with how black families were portrayed in early American media, because the stereotypes have deep historical roots. During slavery and Jim Crow, popular entertainment consistently depicted black people as either childlike and dependent, needing white guidance and control, or as dangerous and threatening, particularly black men who were portrayed as predatory threats to white society and especially to white women. Black fathers were largely absent from these portrayals, which reinforced the idea that black families naturally lack stable male leadership. When black mothers appeared, they were often shown as mammies devoted to white families rather than as women focused on their own households. These weren't accidental choices. They were ideological tools used to justify slavery and segregation by suggesting that black people couldn't function as independent families and needed white control and supervision to maintain any kind of social order. Even as the civil rights movement forced some changes in media representation, the stereotypes evolved rather than disappeared. The 1970s and 80s saw the rise of what became known as the welfare queen narrative, powerfully deployed by politicians like Ronald Reagan, who told stories, often exaggerated or completely fabricated, about black women gaming the welfare system, having multiple children to increase benefits, and living comfortably on government assistance while refusing to work. These narratives were never about actual data on who received welfare or how they used it. Studies consistently showed that most welfare recipients were short-term users who were working or actively seeking work, and that the typical welfare family had the same number of children as non-welfare families. But the welfare queen stereotype served a political purpose by making it easier to cut social programs. If Americans believed that welfare was primarily supporting lazy black women who were deliberately having children to get benefits, it became politically popular to slash those programs, regardless of the reality that most recipients were people genuinely struggling and using assistance exactly as intended to bridge temporary hardship. News media coverage of black communities during the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s was particularly damaging in how it portrayed black families. Inner-city neighborhoods dealing with the fallout of deindustrialization, white flight, and concentrated poverty were shown almost exclusively through the lens of crime, drugs, and violence. News cameras focused on the most sensational elements, crack houses and gang violence, while ignoring the majority of families in those same neighborhoods who were working hard, raising their children, and trying to maintain stability despite impossible circumstances. Black mothers were portrayed as either crack addicts neglecting their children, or as long-suffering figures overwhelmed by the dysfunction around them, but rarely as the complex human beings they actually were. Making difficult choices in circumstances not of their making. Black fathers were presented almost exclusively as either absent, criminal, or dead, with very little coverage of the many black fathers who were present and involved, despite the structural barriers we've discussed. Entertainment media played its own problematic role through both the stereotypes it reinforced and the realities it ignored. Sitcoms occasionally showed stable black families, like The Cosby Show in the 80s, but these were often criticized for being unrealistic, for not showing the struggles that most black families faced, essentially suggesting that positive portrayals of black families were fantasies while dysfunction was the authentic black experience. Meanwhile, movies and later hip-hop videos often portrayed black communities through narrow lenses that emphasize violence, drug dealing, and family breakdown. Young black men were shown as gangsters or hustlers rather than as students, workers, or fathers. Black women were hypersexualized or portrayed as angry and confrontational. These images, consumed by millions of Americans, including young black people themselves, shaped expectations and beliefs about what black families were and could be. When the only images you see of people who look like you show broken families and dysfunction, it affects how you imagine your own future and what seems possible or normal. What makes media stereotypes particularly insidious in our story is how they create a feedback loop with policy and public opinion. Negative media portrayals make the public more supportive of punitive policies like harsh welfare restrictions or aggressive policing and incarceration. Those policies create more family instability and community disruption. That disruption gets covered by media in ways that emphasize pathology and dysfunction. That coverage reinforces stereotypes and makes the public even more supportive of punitive approaches. The cycle continues, with media narratives and destructive policies reinforcing each other, while the actual structural causes, the employment discrimination and housing segregation and failing schools, remain largely unaddressed and often unmentioned in mainstream coverage. The media taught America to see that 73% statistic as evidence of something wrong with black people, rather than as evidence of something deeply wrong with American institutions, and that fundamental misunderstanding has prevented the kind of structural solutions that might actually address the roots of family instability in black communities. But even as these stereotypes dominated popular understanding, they were missing a crucial part of the story about how inequality was being reproduced across generations through the very systems that were supposed to provide opportunity. The media was busy convincing America that black family dysfunction was cultural, but meanwhile, another system was quietly ensuring that even the most stable and determined black families would struggle to lift themselves out of poverty: the education system. Education is supposed to be the great equalizer in America, the ladder that allows any family to climb toward prosperity, regardless of where they start. But for black families, that ladder has been systematically sawed off at the bottom rungs for generations. We're not talking about recent budget cuts or contemporary debates about school choice. We're talking about a multi-generational pattern of educational deprivation, so severe and so deliberate that it functionally guaranteed that children born into struggling families would remain in struggling families, and their children after them, creating exactly the kind of cyclical poverty that people then blamed on family structure rather than on the educational apartheid that caused it. Remember that under slavery, teaching enslaved people to read was literally illegal in most southern states. Slaveholders understood something fundamental. Education is power, and educated people are much harder to control and exploit. So for the entire period of slavery, multiple generations of black Americans were kept deliberately illiterate by law, with severe punishments for anyone caught teaching slaves to read or write. When emancipation finally came, formerly enslaved people were hungry for education, establishing schools in their communities despite having almost no resources, but they were starting from a position of complete educational deprivation. Meanwhile, white families had been accumulating educational advantages across generations, with literate parents teaching children to read before they even started school, with family libraries and educational resources, with social networks that included educated people who could provide guidance and opportunities. The educational head start white families had over black families in 1865 was already enormous, and rather than helping black families catch up, American educational policy for the next 100+ years worked to widen that gap even further. During the Jim Crow era, as we mentioned earlier, Southern states spent dramatically less on black schools than white schools. But let's really examine what that meant in practical terms for family trajectories. A black child in the 1920s or 30s might attend school in a dilapidated building with no heat in winter, using textbooks that were decades old and had already been worn out by white students before being passed down. That child might have one teacher responsible for multiple grade levels in a single classroom. The school year for black children was often shortened to accommodate planting and harvest seasons because black families needed their children's labor to survive economically under sharecropping. That child's parents, who had themselves received inadequate education, couldn't provide the kind of homework help and educational support that white children whose parents had better education could provide. So, this black child, through no fault of their own or their families, received an education that was maybe equivalent to 5 or 6 years of what white children were getting in the same time frame. That child grows up, has limited employment opportunities because of their inadequate education combined with racial discrimination, struggles economically, and then has children of their own who attend similarly under-resourced schools. The cycle repeats, with each generation starting from behind and never given the resources to catch up. Even after Brown versus Board of Education supposedly desegregated schools in 1954, educational inequality persisted through different mechanisms. Many school districts engaged in massive resistance, simply refusing to integrate for years or even decades. When integration finally happened, it was often accompanied by white flight, where white families moved to suburbs or enrolled their children in private schools, taking their tax dollars with them and leaving urban schools that were increasingly black and increasingly under-resourced. School funding in America is heavily dependent on local property taxes, which means that neighborhoods with expensive homes generate lots of school funding, while neighborhoods with cheap homes, like the redlined areas where black families were forced to live, generate minimal funding. This system essentially guaranteed that black children would attend schools with less money for teachers, facilities, books, technology, and all the resources that contribute to educational success. It wasn't that black parents didn't value education, or that black students weren't capable. It was that the schools available to them were systematically deprived of the resources necessary to provide quality education. The connection between educational inequality and family structure is direct and powerful, though often overlooked in discussions about that 73% statistic. Education is the primary determinant of lifetime earning potential in modern America. People with college degrees earn roughly twice as much over their lifetimes as people with only high school diplomas, and people with only high school diplomas earn significantly more than people who don't finish high school. When black children are funneled into under-resourced schools where graduation rates are low and college preparation is inadequate, they are being set up for economic struggle regardless of their family structure or personal character. A young man who doesn't finish high school or who graduates but without the preparation necessary to succeed in college faces extremely limited employment prospects in the modern economy. That young man, even if he desperately wants to be a present father and provider, is going to struggle to support a family, which brings us right back to the economic barriers to family formation we discussed earlier. Educational inequality creates economic inequality, which creates barriers to stable family formation, which then gets blamed on cultural dysfunction rather than on the systematic educational deprivation that started the cycle. The generational nature of educational inequality is what makes it so destructive and so difficult to overcome. Children whose parents went to college are far more likely to go to college themselves, not just because of financial resources, but because of knowledge about how to navigate the college application process, expectations about education's importance, help with homework, and countless other advantages that educated parents can provide their children. Black families, because of generations of educational exclusion, are less likely to have parents and grandparents with college experience, which means they're less likely to have that knowledge and those networks even when individual children are talented and motivated. You end up with a situation where Black families have to work twice as hard to achieve educational outcomes that come more easily to white families who have been accumulating educational advantages across generations. And when Black children struggle academically or don't pursue higher education at the same rates as white children, society blames the families rather than examining the systematic educational deprivation that created vastly unequal starting points and continues to provide vastly unequal resources to Black and white students even today. Educational inequality was systematically limiting Black families' economic prospects across generations, but there was another force working simultaneously to destabilize families in ways that often go unrecognized in discussions about family structure: health disparities. When we talk about that 73% statistic, we rarely consider how chronic illness, premature death, untreated mental health conditions, and lack of access to health care have undermined Black families' ability to stay together and function across multiple generations. Health and family stability are intimately connected. A family dealing with serious illness faces enormous stress that can tear relationships apart. A parent who dies young leaves children without critical support and guidance. A community where people are chronically sick and dying prematurely becomes a community where stable, multi-generational families are difficult to maintain. And Black Americans have faced health disparities so severe and so persistent that they represent another form of systematic family destruction that compounds all the other factors we've discussed. Let's start with the most basic and devastating health disparity: life expectancy. Even today, Black Americans have a life expectancy that's several years shorter than white Americans. And historically, that gap was even wider. This isn't about genetics or biology. This is about systematic differences in healthcare access, environmental conditions, stress levels, and the cumulative health impacts of poverty and discrimination. What this means in practical terms for families is profound. Black children are more likely to lose parents and grandparents prematurely, which disrupts family structures and removes sources of support, wisdom, and stability that are crucial for family continuity. A grandmother who might have provided childcare and guidance dies of diabetes or heart disease in her 50s instead of living into her 80s like her white counterparts. A father dies of untreated hypertension in his 40s, leaving his children without his presence during their critical teenage years. These premature deaths ripple through families, creating instability and loss that affects family formation patterns for generations. Healthcare access has been systematically denied to Black Americans throughout history in ways that created cascading family problems. During Jim Crow, hospitals were segregated, with Black patients either excluded entirely or relegated to inferior facilities with outdated equipment and fewer doctors. Black communities often had no nearby hospitals at all, meaning that serious illness or injury required traveling long distances to find care, and many people simply didn't survive the journey or couldn't afford to make it in the first place. Even after formal segregation ended, healthcare remained largely inaccessible to many Black families because of cost. Without employer-provided health insurance, which was less common in the low-wage jobs Black workers were relegated to, and without the money to pay for care directly, Black families often went without medical treatment until conditions became severe and emergency care was unavoidable. Preventable conditions became chronic. Manageable diseases became deadly. The stress of watching family members suffer without being able to afford care created psychological trauma that affected relationships and family functioning. The specific health conditions that disproportionately affect Black Americans read like a catalog of systematic neglect and environmental racism: hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, maternal mortality during childbirth, infant mortality, asthma, lead poisoning, and numerous other conditions occur at significantly higher rates in Black communities. Some of this is attributable to poverty and the stress that comes with economic struggle and discrimination, chronic stress literally changes body chemistry in ways that increase disease risk. Some of it is attributable to environmental factors like living in neighborhoods with pollution, poor housing conditions that expose families to mold and lead paint, and lack of access to healthy food because grocery stores won't locate in poor Black neighborhoods. Some of it is attributable to healthcare system bias, where Black patients' symptoms are taken less seriously, their pain is undertreated, and they receive lower quality care even when they do access medical services. All of these factors combine to create health outcomes that systematically undermine Black families. Mental health deserves particular attention because the connection between mental health and family stability is direct and often overlooked. Generations of trauma, from slavery through Jim Crow through mass incarceration, have created high rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress in Black communities. But mental health treatment has been even less accessible than physical health treatment, both because of cost and because of stigma within communities that developed mistrust of medical systems that historically experimented on Black people without consent or provided substandard care. Untreated depression affects parenting, relationships, and a person's ability to maintain employment and fulfill family responsibilities. Untreated trauma gets passed down to children who grow up in households shaped by their parents' unresolved psychological wounds. Substance abuse, which is often a form of self-medication for mental health issues, creates obvious family instability. The failure to address mental health in Black communities systematically has contributed to family breakdown in ways that are rarely acknowledged when people talk about family structure statistics. The cumulative effect of health disparities on family structure becomes clear when you consider how illness and premature death remove adults from families during crucial periods. A mother dealing with chronic illness may struggle to work and provide for children, creating economic stress that strains or breaks relationships. A father with untreated diabetes who loses his sight or requires amputation becomes unable to work and may feel he's failed his family, creating shame and relationship strain. Children who grow up watching parents struggle with illness learn that adults can't always be reliable sources of support, which affects how they approach their own relationships and family formation later. Communities where people are constantly sick and dying become communities where stable family structures are simply harder to maintain across time because the people who would provide that stability keep being removed by premature death or debilitating illness. Health disparities don't just make individual lives harder, they systematically undermine the multi-generational family stability that other communities take for granted, contributing to the very family structure patterns that then get blamed on cultural dysfunction rather than on the systematic health neglect that helped create them. We've spent the last 14 sections documenting a relentless catalog of destruction. Slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow, migration disruption, redlining, employment discrimination, the Moynihan Report, welfare policies that penalized marriage, mass incarceration, media stereotypes, educational deprivation, and health disparities. It's an overwhelming litany of systematic oppression spanning 4 centuries, each element compounding the others to create conditions where stable family formation became extraordinarily difficult. But here's what's remarkable. What speaks to something profound about human resilience and the strength of Black communities specifically. Despite all of this, Black families survived. Not just survived, but created systems of support, networks of care, and forms of family that adapted to impossible circumstances while maintaining love, connection, and continuity across generations. This cultural resilience doesn't erase the damage done by systematic oppression, but it does complicate the simple narrative that Black families are broken. What looks like breakdown from the outside often looks like creative adaptation from the inside. Extended family networks became one of the primary mechanisms through which Black communities preserved family continuity, even when nuclear 2-parent households were difficult to maintain. When a father was sold away during slavery, or imprisoned during mass incarceration, or killed young by poor health or violence, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, and cousins stepped in to help raise children. This wasn't a failure of family. This was family functioning differently than the nuclear model that American society treats as the only legitimate form. but functioning nonetheless to ensure children were cared for and connected to kin. Studies of black families consistently show that even when biological fathers aren't present in households, extended family members often provide crucial support, guidance, and material assistance. A child might not live with their father, but they might have deep relationships with grandfathers, uncles, or other male relatives who serve as father figures and role models. These extended networks created a kind of collective parenting that distributed the responsibilities of child rearing across multiple adults, which actually provided some advantages in terms of support and supervision, even as it developed partly in response to circumstances that made two-parent households difficult. The Black church historically served as another critical institution, supporting families when other institutions failed them. Churches provided not just spiritual guidance, but practical assistance, community connection, and a sense of dignity and worth that the outside world constantly tried to deny. Churches ran food banks, helped families pay rent during emergencies, provided child care, offered marriage counseling, created youth programs, and served as social centers where community networks formed and strengthened. When families struggled, church communities often rallied around them with support that helped them weather crises that might otherwise have torn them apart. The church also provided moral frameworks and community expectations that encouraged family stability, even when economic circumstances made that stability difficult to achieve. While church attendance has declined in recent decades across all American communities, including Black ones, during the periods we've been discussing, the church was often the primary institution holding communities together and supporting families through impossible circumstances. Fictive kinship, the practice of treating non-relatives as family members with the obligations and connections that implies, became another adaptive strategy that Black communities developed, partly in response to the systematic disruption of biological families. Someone might refer to a close family friend as aunt or uncle, even without blood relation, and that person would function as family in terms of providing support, guidance, and assistance when needed. Children might be informally adopted or fostered by neighbors or friends when parents couldn't care for them, without any involvement of formal systems that Black families often mistrusted because of historical experiences, with those systems removing children and not necessarily acting in their best interests. This expansion of family beyond strict biological definitions created flexibility and redundancy in support systems, meaning that when one part of the network failed, others could step in. It also reflected African cultural traditions that many enslaved people brought with them, traditions that emphasized community and collective responsibility in ways that differed from the European emphasis on nuclear family units. Cultural transmission through storytelling, music, and shared history helped maintain family and community identity, even across separation and disruption. When families were broken apart during slavery, when men were incarcerated and removed from daily family life, when migration separated relatives by hundreds of miles, the stories families told about their history, the music that expressed their struggles and hopes, and the cultural practices they maintained, created threads of continuity that kept family connections alive, even across distance and time. Children learned who they were and where they came from through these cultural transmissions, which provided identity and grounding even when family structures were unstable. The emphasis on oral history in Black communities developed partly because literacy was denied during slavery, but it persisted as a powerful way of maintaining family memory and teaching younger generations about resilience and survival. What's important to understand about this cultural resilience is that it represents both strength and adaptation to oppression, and we need to hold both of those truths simultaneously. Yes, Black communities developed remarkable systems of mutual support and family continuity that deserve recognition and respect. Yes, extended family networks and community institutions like churches provided crucial support that helped families survive and sometimes thrive despite impossible circumstances. But also, these adaptive strategies developed because systematic oppression made traditional family structures extremely difficult to maintain. And it's not right to romanticize adaptations to oppression as if they were freely chosen cultural preferences rather than creative responses to violence and exclusion. A grandmother raising her grandchildren because their father is in prison and their mother is working 3 jobs to survive is showing remarkable love and sacrifice. But she's also dealing with a situation that was created by mass incarcerations and employment discrimination, not by her family's choices or cultural values. The resilience of black families in the face of centuries of systematic destruction is genuinely extraordinary and speaks to deep reserves of strength, creativity, and commitment. But that resilience shouldn't be used to minimize the damage done or to suggest that everything is fine, because families found ways to survive. Survival isn't the same as thriving. Adaptation to oppression isn't the same as freedom from oppression. And the fact that black families developed systems to cope with systematic destruction doesn't mean that destruction was acceptable or that its effects have disappeared. The 73% statistic reflects both the damage done by centuries of oppression and the ways families adapted to that damage, and understanding both elements is crucial. But adaptation alone couldn't overcome the systematic barriers to family stability. And even as communities were finding ways to survive, there were movements rising up to fight for something more than survival. Movements that understood that black families deserved not just to adapt to oppression, but to be free from it entirely. While black families were moving north, searching for opportunity, the federal government was simultaneously constructing one of the most devastating wealth destruction machines ever created in America, and most people have never even heard of it. It's called redlining, and if you want to understand why black families today have roughly 1/10 the wealth of white families, why stable home ownership has been so elusive in black communities, and how housing policy directly undermined family formation, you need to understand what happened starting in the 1930s and continuing for decades afterward. This wasn't some accidental policy failure or unintended consequence. This was the United States government officially designating black neighborhoods as hazardous investments and systematically denying black families access to the primary way American families build wealth: home ownership. Here's how it worked. In 1933, during the Great Depression, the federal government created the Home Owners Loan Corporation to help Americans buy homes by providing government-backed mortgages with low interest rates and long repayment terms. This was revolutionary because it made home ownership accessible to working and middle-class families who previously couldn't afford it. But there was a catch that would prove catastrophic for black families. The government created maps of American cities, color-coding neighborhoods based on their perceived investment risk. Neighborhoods with significant black populations, and in many cases, neighborhoods with even a single black family, were outlined in red and marked as hazardous. Banks wouldn't provide mortgages in these redlined areas, which meant black families were systematically denied access to government-backed home loans, even when they had stable incomes and good credit. Meanwhile, white families were able to buy homes in green and blue-coded neighborhoods with government assistance, beginning their journey toward building generational wealth through home equity. The impact on family stability was immediate and profound. Home ownership does something psychologically and practically that renting can never do. When you own your home, you have stability and control over your living situation that creates a foundation for everything else in family life. You can put down roots in a community, establish relationships with neighbors, get your children into schools knowing they won't have to move mid-year because a landlord decided to sell or raise the rent. You build equity that becomes an asset you can borrow against during emergencies or use to fund your children's education. You have something tangible to pass down to the next generation, giving them a head start that you never had. White families were building all of this during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, while black families were locked out, forced to remain renters in neighborhoods that were systematically disinvested and allowed to deteriorate. Redlining also created a vicious cycle that compounded over time. Because banks wouldn't invest in black neighborhoods, those areas received no capital for maintenance, no renovation, or business development. Buildings fell into disrepair because landlords knew they could rent to black families who had no other options and therefore didn't need to maintain properties. Grocery stores, quality retailers, and other businesses either left these neighborhoods or never arrived in the first place because they couldn't get loans to operate there. Schools in redline neighborhoods received less funding because they were based on property taxes, and properties in redlined areas were worth less by design. The neighborhoods where black families were forced to live became exactly the kind of unstable, under-resourced environments that make maintaining stable family structures incredibly difficult. The relationship between housing and family formation is direct and powerful. When a young couple considers getting married and starting a family, one of their primary considerations is whether they can provide a stable home environment for children. If home ownership is impossible, if you're perpetually at the mercy of landlords, if the neighborhoods where you can afford to live are deteriorating and unsafe, that calculus changes. Some couples delay marriage or childbearing, waiting for stability that never comes. Others have children without the married, stable household they would have preferred, because they realize that stability isn't going to materialize no matter how long they wait. The housing discrimination embedded in redlining didn't just prevent wealth accumulation. It actively disrupted the normal progression of courtship, marriage, and family formation that other Americans were experiencing during the same decades. What makes redlining particularly insidious in our story is its timing. Just as black families were escaping Jim Crow and establishing themselves in northern and western cities, just as they were finally accessing industrial jobs that paid enough to support families, the federal government ensured they couldn't translate those incomes into the home ownership that would have stabilized their communities and families across generations. White families who earned the same incomes were buying homes in suburbs that would appreciate enormously in value over the following decades. Black families earning the same incomes were trapped in redlined urban neighborhoods that would decline in value, concentrating poverty and all its associated problems in exactly the places where black families were trying to build their lives. By the time redlining was officially outlawed in 1968, multiple generations of black families had been denied the opportunity to build home equity, creating a wealth gap that persists to this day and continues to affect family stability in black communities. The civil rights movement had won legal victories and created possibilities for black family advancement that hadn't existed before. But here's the dark truth that rarely gets discussed openly. There were powerful entities that had financial and political interests in maintaining black family instability. This isn't conspiracy theory or paranoid speculation. This is documented history of how corporations, industries, and political operatives recognized that they could profit from or gain power through the continued disruption of black families and communities. When we ask why the problems we've been discussing weren't solved, even after they were recognized and even after legal barriers were removed, part of the answer is that solving them would have cost certain people money and power. And those people worked very hard to make sure solutions never materialized. Let's start with this prison industrial complex, because it's one of the clearest examples of direct financial profit from black family destruction. The explosion of incarceration we discussed earlier created an entire industry of companies that profit from keeping people locked up. Private prison corporations like Corrections, Corporation of America, now called CoreCivic, and GEO Group operate prisons under government contracts that often include occupancy guarantees, meaning the government agrees to keep the prison at a certain percentage of capacity or pay penalties. These companies literally make more money when more people are imprisoned, creating a financial incentive to maintain or increase incarceration rates. The industry spends millions on lobbying for tougher sentencing laws, against criminal justice reform, and for policies that funnel more people into prisons. They're not subtle about this. It's in their financial disclosures to investors that changes in criminal justice policy represent risks to their business model, when those people being imprisoned are disproportionately black men being removed from their families and communities. The prison industry is directly profiting from black family separation. But private prisons are just the most obvious part of a much larger system that profits from incarceration. Companies that provide phone services to prisons charge inmates and their families rates that are 10 to 15 times higher than regular phone service, extracting hundreds or thousands of dollars from poor families desperate to maintain contact with incarcerated loved ones. Commissary services that sell basic necessities to inmates at inflated prices generate enormous profits. Companies that operate prison labor programs pay inmates pennies per hour while charging full market rates to the governments and corporations benefiting from that labor, essentially recreating slavery's economic model with a legal veneer. Bail bond companies profit from a system that keeps poor people, disproportionately black, locked up before trial because they can't afford bail. The entire ecosystem around incarceration represents billions of dollars in revenue that depends on maintaining high incarceration rates, which means maintaining the removal of black men from their families and communities. The political profits from black family instability have been equally significant and perhaps even more insidious. Conservative politicians from the 1960s onward recognized that they could win elections by stoking white fear about black crime and black family dysfunction, using coded racial language about welfare queens, crime in the streets, and law and order. This is documented history, not speculation. Republican strategist Lee Atwater famously explained in a 1981 interview how racial appeals evolved to use abstract terminology rather than explicit slurs, saying politicians couldn't say certain words anymore, but could talk about things like forced busing and states' rights, and achieve the same result of appealing to racial resentment. The welfare reform debates of the 1980s and 90s consistently used imagery of black mothers and played on stereotypes about black family dysfunction to build support for cutting social programs, even though most welfare recipients were actually white. Politicians built entire careers on being tough on crime and reforming welfare, policies that devastated black families while winning elections by appealing to racial fears and resentments. Industries that profit from concentrated poverty also had financial interests in maintaining conditions that kept black families economically struggling. Predatory lending operations, including payday loan companies and subprime mortgage lenders, specifically target poor communities, particularly black communities, extracting wealth through exploitative interest rates and terms. The subprime mortgage crisis that triggered the 2008 financial collapse disproportionately affected black families because lenders had specifically targeted black homeowners for subprime loans even when they qualified for conventional mortgages with better terms. Banks made enormous profits on these loans before the collapse, and then when families couldn't pay, those same banks foreclosed and resold the properties, sometimes multiple times. Rent-to-own stores, check cashing services, title loan operations, all of these businesses make money specifically from people who are financially struggling and who lack access to traditional banking and credit, and they concentrate their operations in poor black neighborhoods where those conditions are most prevalent. The media industry we discussed earlier also profited from negative portrayals of black families in ways that created financial incentives to continue those portrayals. News coverage that emphasized crime and dysfunction in black communities attracted viewers through fear and sensationalism, which translated to advertising revenue. Reality television shows and certain genres of entertainment programming found that showing black dysfunction was profitable, attracting both white audiences interested in voyeuristic consumption of black struggle and black audiences who might watch to criticize or defend the representations. Music industry executives profited from promoting hip-hop that emphasized gangster imagery and family dysfunction, while marginalizing artists who presented more diverse portrayals of black life. Each of these industries made editorial and programming choices based partly on what would be profitable, and negative portrayals of black families proved profitable in ways that more nuanced or positive representations often were not. What makes these profit motives particularly damaging is that they created powerful opposition to policies that might have actually helped stabilize black families. Every time someone proposed criminal justice reform that might reduce incarceration, the prison industry and police unions mobilized against it. Every time someone proposed expanding social programs that might help struggling families, conservative politicians and their corporate backers fought it by invoking racial stereotypes about dependency and dysfunction. Every time someone tried to regulate predatory lending or ban exploitative financial services, the industries profiting from those practices spent millions on lobbying and campaign contributions to stop reform. The result was that even as the problems became obvious and the solutions became clear, the political and economic power of entities profiting from black family instability prevented meaningful change from occurring. Black families were trapped in systems that were profitable for powerful interests, and those interests worked hard to maintain the systems regardless of the human cost. The question of why that 73% statistic exists can't be fully answered without acknowledging these profit motives and political incentives. It's not enough to document historical oppression and systematic barriers. We also have to recognize that maintaining those barriers and their effects served the financial and political interests of powerful entities that worked to prevent solutions, even when solutions became possible. Black families weren't just facing historical legacies and structural barriers, they were facing active, ongoing opposition from forces that profited from their instability and used their power to maintain it. But even in the face of these overwhelming systemic forces working against them, Black women in particular carried families forward through generations, often at enormous personal cost that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. Throughout this entire historical journey, from slave ships to auction blocks to sharecropping fields to Jim Crow segregation to northern migration to redlined neighborhoods to welfare offices to visiting rooms in prisons, there has been one constant presence holding Black families together against impossible odds: Black mothers. Specifically, Black mothers who found themselves raising children alone or as the primary parent, not because they chose single motherhood as some kind of preferred lifestyle, but because every single system we've discussed systematically removed, excluded, incapacitated, or killed Black fathers while simultaneously ensuring that Black mothers had no choice but to carry the full weight of family survival on their shoulders. When we talk about that 73% statistic, we need to talk about what it actually represents on the ground, which is millions of Black women performing superhuman feats of love, sacrifice, and endurance while being blamed by society for the family structures that oppression created. Let's go back to slavery for a moment to understand where this pattern really begins. Enslaved mothers knew that their children could be sold away from them at any moment, yet they loved those children fiercely and fought desperately to keep them close for as long as possible. They taught their children survival skills, passed down whatever knowledge and culture they could, and tried to provide some sense of family and belonging even under conditions designed to make that impossible. When fathers were sold away, which happened constantly, mothers became the sole consistent presence in children's lives, the only parent who might remain, though even that was never guaranteed. This created a pattern where Black children learned to see their mothers as the stable center of family, while fathers, through no fault of their own, were often absent or temporary presences. That pattern wasn't a cultural choice or a value statement about gender roles. It was an adaptation to the reality that slavery systematically destroyed father presence while mothers, as the ones who gave birth and nursed children, were sometimes kept with young children slightly longer before being separated. After emancipation, as Black families tried to establish themselves under sharecropping and Jim Crow, Black mothers faced the impossible challenge of keeping families fed and housed when their husbands and the fathers of their children often couldn't find work that paid enough to support a family, or were terrorized out of communities, or were arrested and disappeared into convict leasing, or were simply killed by the violence that pervaded Black life under white supremacy. Women worked in white people's homes as domestic servants, often raising white children, while their own children were left with relatives or older siblings. They worked in fields alongside men for a fraction of the pay. They took in laundry, sold produce, did whatever work they could find to contribute to family survival. And when men couldn't be present, whether because they'd been driven away by economic desperation or violence, or because they'd left seeking work elsewhere, or because they were simply dead, Black mothers carried on raising children alone because the alternative was letting those children starve or be taken by hostile systems. The Great Migration created a particular burden for Black mothers as families fragmented across geography. Women often found themselves in northern cities, either separated from their husbands who had gone ahead to find work but never sent for them, or raising children alone while husbands worked brutal hours at factory jobs that left them exhausted and often injured or killed in industrial accidents. The support networks of extended family that had existed in the South were disrupted, leaving mothers more isolated than previous generations had been. They navigated unfamiliar urban systems, hostile white neighbors, overcrowded and overpriced housing, and all the challenges of raising children in environments that were often more dangerous and alienating than what they'd left behind in the South. The strength required to maintain family life under these circumstances, while also often working outside the home, was extraordinary. Yet it was treated as normal, as simply what Black mothers did because there was no other choice. The welfare system that we discussed earlier placed Black single mothers in an impossible position where they became the public face of supposed dependency and dysfunction, even though they were actually making rational economic decisions in response to policy that penalized father presence. These women became scapegoats for poverty that they didn't create and family structures that systematic oppression had forced upon them. The welfare queen stereotype specifically targeted black single mothers, portraying them as lazy and manipulative, when the reality was that most were working or actively seeking work, were using assistance exactly as intended to supplement inadequate wages or bridge periods of unemployment, and were raising children under conditions of poverty that were created by all the systematic barriers we've discussed throughout this video. They were vilified for needing help that they only needed because centuries of oppression had destroyed black families' ability to accumulate wealth and access opportunity. Mass incarceration created yet another generation of black single mothers, women who watched the fathers of their children disappear into prisons for years or decades, leaving them to raise children alone while also trying to support incarcerated partners through expensive phone calls and commissary deposits. These women faced all the challenges of single parenthood, while also dealing with the stigma of having a partner in prison, the emotional toll of maintaining relationships across prison walls, and the practical difficulties of explaining to children why their father was gone and when or if he'd return. When fathers eventually came home, if they came home, they often returned damaged by prison, unable to find work because of their criminal records, and struggling to reintegrate into families that had learned to function without them. The burden of managing these reunifications and helping formerly incarcerated men rebuild their lives while also continuing to hold families together fell disproportionately on black women. What needs to be absolutely clear is that black single mothers throughout history have not been failing their children or their communities. They have been succeeding at an impossible task that was forced upon them by systematic oppression. They have raised children who grew up to be productive adults despite having almost no resources and facing obstacles that would have crushed most people. They have maintained family bonds across separations, preserved cultural knowledge and identity across generations, and created homes full of love even in neighborhoods full of violence and despair. The fact that outcomes for children raised by single mothers are statistically worse than outcomes for children raised in two-parent households is not an indictment of single mothers. It's an indictment of a society that creates conditions where single parenthood becomes common and then refuses to provide the support that single-parent households need to thrive. Black single mothers have been performing miracles of resilience for generations, and instead of being honored for that resilience, they've been blamed for the family structures that oppression created. That blame continues today whenever someone cites that 73% statistic as evidence of cultural dysfunction, rather than as evidence of remarkable survival in the face of systematic destruction. And it continues through the way that trauma and disruption from centuries of oppression get transmitted across generations, even among families who are trying desperately to break free from historical patterns. Black mothers have been holding families together against impossible odds for generations, performing feats of strength and sacrifice that deserve far more recognition than blame. But here's the painful reality that we need to confront as we approach the end of this historical journey. Trauma doesn't just disappear when the immediate crisis ends. The centuries of systematic family destruction we've been documenting created wounds that get passed down from parents to children to grandchildren, not through genetics or inevitability, but through the psychological, emotional, and behavioral patterns that develop in response to trauma, and that shape how the next generation understands relationships, family, and their place in the world. This is what researchers call intergenerational or generational trauma. And it's a critical piece of understanding why that 73% statistic exists today, even though slavery ended over 150 years ago and Jim Crow ended 60 years ago. The trauma doesn't respect those timelines. It persists and transforms across generations in ways that continue to affect family formation long after the original source of trauma has supposedly ended. Think about what it means for a child to grow up watching their parent live in constant fear of family separation, whether that fear comes from slavery's auction block, Jim Crow's violence, or mass incarceration's prison cells. That child learns at a fundamental level that attachment is dangerous, that loving someone deeply means setting yourself up for devastating loss, that families are inherently unstable and temporary. Those lessons don't get taught through explicit conversations. They get absorbed through observation and experience, through watching how adults around you navigate relationships, through the anxiety and hypervigilance that traumatized parents carry, even when they're trying to protect their children from their own fears. When that child grows up and forms their own relationships, they carry those lessons with them. They might struggle with intimacy because intimacy feels dangerous. They might avoid deep commitment because commitment has historically led to loss. They might replicate patterns of instability, not because they want to, but because instability is what they know, what feels normal, what their nervous system has been trained to expect. The specific trauma of father absence across multiple generations creates particularly complex patterns that directly relate to our 73% statistic. When a girl grows up without her father present, whether because he was enslaved and sold away, or imprisoned or killed young, or simply unable to find work and provide, so he disappeared out of shame and economic desperation, she doesn't receive modeling of what healthy father involvement looks like. She doesn't learn through daily observation what fathers do, how they contribute to family life, what to expect from male partners as parents. When she becomes an adult and has children of her own, she's operating without that template. She might choose partners based on criteria that don't include fathering potential because she doesn't have a clear sense of what good fathering looks like. She might not expect or demand father involvement because father absence is her normal. This isn't about individual failing or bad choices. This is about how growing up without something means you don't develop the internal models and expectations that guide behavior when you encounter similar situations in your own life. For boys who grow up without fathers present, the patterns are equally complex and equally tied to historical trauma. A boy who doesn't have a father in his daily life is missing crucial modeling of how to be a man, how to be a partner, how to be a father. He's left to figure out masculinity from peers, from media, from street culture, from sources that might provide distorted or limited versions of what manhood can be. When he becomes a father himself, he's working without the experiential knowledge that comes from watching a father navigate parenting challenges, make decisions about children, balance work and family responsibilities, repair relationships after conflicts. He might want desperately to be a present father, to break the cycle of absence he experienced, but not have the practical knowledge or emotional tools to do it successfully. He might replicate his own father's absence, not because he doesn't love his children, but because he literally doesn't know how to do it differently, doesn't have the internal resources and models that would enable him to create a different pattern. Economic trauma also transmits across generations in ways that affect family formation. When multiple generations have lived in poverty, have watched parents work constantly without ever getting ahead, have experienced the stress and shame of economic insecurity, that creates lasting effects on how people approach economic decisions, including decisions about family formation. Someone who grew up watching their parents struggle financially might be extremely cautious about having children, waiting for economic stability that never quite arrives because the structural barriers we've discussed make stability so difficult to achieve. Or they might have children without waiting for stability because their experience has taught them that stability never comes, so waiting is pointless. Or they might avoid marriage because they've watched economic stress destroy their parents' relationship and they're trying to protect themselves from that pain. These aren't irrational decisions. They're rational responses to generational economic trauma, but they contribute to family formation patterns that deviate from the two-parent married household model that society treats as the ideal. The trauma of discrimination and racism itself gets transmitted across generations in ways that affect family life and relationships. Parents who have experienced intense racism, who have been denied opportunities and dignity, who have had to teach their children survival strategies for navigating a hostile society, carry stress and pain that affects how they parent and how they relate to partners. They might be overprotective in ways that limit children's development because they're terrified of what might happen to those children in a racist society. They might be emotionally distant because they've learned to armor themselves against pain and can't easily turn that armor off at home. They might have explosive anger that seems disproportionate to immediate triggers because it's actually accumulated rage from years or lifetimes of experiencing injustice and having to swallow that rage to survive. These trauma responses affect family dynamics and children's development, and then those children carry their own versions of the trauma into the next generation, creating cycles that persist long after the original traumatic events. What makes generational trauma particularly relevant to understanding the 73% statistic is recognizing that current family formation patterns aren't just responses to current conditions. They're also responses to historical conditions that shaped how parents and grandparents and great-grandparents understood family, relationships, and what was possible or safe. A young couple deciding whether to marry before having a child isn't just making that decision based on their current economic situation or their feelings for each other. They're also unconsciously influenced by family patterns they observed growing up, by trauma responses they inherited from parents who inherited them from their own parents, by cultural adaptations to oppression that developed over generations and became normalized as just how things are. Breaking those patterns requires not just changing current conditions, though that's essential, but also healing trauma that has roots reaching back through multiple generations. And that brings us finally to the question of what we actually do about all of this. How we address a problem with 400-year-old roots that has created that 73% statistic we started with and all the pain and struggle that number represents. We've traveled through 4 centuries of systematic destruction, from auction blocks to prison cells, from sharecropping fields to redlined neighborhoods, from Jim Crow laws to welfare policies that punished marriage, from employment discrimination to mass incarceration to health disparities to generational trauma. We've seen how that 73% statistic didn't emerge from cultural dysfunction or moral failure, but from deliberate systematic policies and practices that made stable 2-parent Black families extraordinarily difficult to form and maintain across generations. We've documented the damage in exhaustive detail. Now comes the hardest and most important question. What do we actually do about it? How do we address a problem with roots this deep, with causes this complex, with damage this extensive? The answer has to be as comprehensive as the problem itself, and it has to start with understanding that there are no quick fixes or simple solutions when you're trying to heal wounds that took 400 years to create. The first and most fundamental requirement for moving forward is acknowledging the full historical truth of what created this crisis. That means teaching this history accurately in schools, not the sanitized version that skips from slavery to the civil rights movement, with barely a mention of what happened in between and almost nothing about what's happened since. Students need to understand redlining, the actual mechanisms of how it worked and who it benefited. They need to understand how welfare policies penalized marriage and why. They need to understand mass incarceration as a system of family destruction, not just as a law enforcement response to crime. They need to understand employment discrimination, housing segregation, educational inequality, health disparities, all of it, taught not as abstract history but as ongoing systems that continue to shape present reality. Without this understanding, Americans will continue to see that 73% statistic as evidence of something wrong with Black people, rather than as evidence of something deeply wrong with American institutions. The conversation can't change until the understanding changes, and the understanding can't change until the history is taught honestly. Economic solutions have to be central to any meaningful response, because so much of family instability traces back to economic insecurity and the systematic denial of opportunities to build wealth. This means addressing employment discrimination that persists despite being illegal, not just through anti-discrimination laws that are already on the books, but through active enforcement, regular auditing of hiring practices, and real consequences for companies that systematically exclude or underpay Black workers. It means investing in job training and education programs that provide pathways to careers that pay family-sustaining wages, not just low-wage service jobs, but skilled trades, technology, healthcare, and other growing sectors. It means reconsidering the entire structure of how we fund education so that Black children aren't attending schools with a fraction of the resources available to white children in wealthier districts. It means addressing the wealth gap through programs that help Black families build assets. Whether through home ownership assistance, support for Black-owned businesses, or even more direct approaches like baby bonds or trust funds that give every child born into poverty a financial foundation to build on as they reach adulthood. Criminal justice reform is absolutely essential and has to go far beyond modest adjustments to sentencing guidelines. We need to fundamentally rethink mass incarceration, recognizing that removing millions of black men from their families and communities has been catastrophic, and that most of those people were never dangerous to begin with. This means ending the war on drugs and treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. It means eliminating mandatory minimum sentences that remove judicial discretion and result in absurdly harsh punishments for non-violent offenses. It means investing in alternatives to incarceration like drug courts, mental health treatment, and community-based supervision that keep people connected to their families rather than warehousing them in prisons. It means reforming bail systems that keep poor people locked up before trial simply because they can't afford to pay for release. It means automatic expungement of records for people who complete their sentences so that one mistake doesn't become a lifetime barrier to employment and stability. And it means dismantling the profit motives we discussed earlier by ending private prisons, regulating the costs of prison phone calls and commissary services, and ensuring that criminal justice policy is driven by public safety and rehabilitation rather than by corporate profits. We need to completely restructure social safety net programs to support rather than penalize family formation. The welfare rules that required fathers to be absent from households to qualify for benefits were partially reformed in the 1990s. But many programs still create marriage penalties where two-parent households receive less assistance than they would if the parents remained unmarried. These penalties need to be eliminated entirely. Benefits should be structured to support family stability, regardless of marital status, recognizing that the goal is ensuring children's well-being, rather than enforcing particular family structures. This might mean moving toward more universal programs like child allowances that go to all families with children, regardless of income or family structure. Reducing the stigma and administrative barriers that make current programs so difficult to access. It means ensuring that healthcare is accessible regardless of employment status or family structure, so that people aren't forced to remain unmarried to maintain Medicaid coverage. It means housing assistance that's adequate to actual housing costs and available to all families who need it, rather than reaching only a small fraction of eligible households. Healthcare access and mental health services need massive expansion in Black communities, addressing the health disparities we discussed that undermine family stability through chronic illness and premature death. This means ensuring universal healthcare coverage so that economic barriers don't prevent people from getting treatment for preventable and manageable conditions. It means addressing the social determinants of health by investing in Black neighborhoods, cleaning up environmental hazards, ensuring access to healthy food, and creating conditions where people can actually be healthy, rather than just treating diseases after they develop. It means dramatically expanding access to mental health services and working to reduce stigma within communities so that people actually use those services. It means training healthcare providers to recognize and address their own biases so that Black patients receive the same quality care as white patients. It means supporting research into the health effects of racism and trauma so that we better understand how to treat conditions that have roots in systematic oppression. Supporting Black families also requires rebuilding and strengthening community institutions that historically provided support networks. This means investing in Black churches, community centers, and grassroots organizations that connect families to resources and to each other. It means supporting programs that specifically work with fathers, helping them develop parenting skills, navigate employment barriers, and stay connected to their children even when they don't live with them full time. It means creating mentorship programs that connect young people with positive role models who can provide guidance and support that might be missing from their immediate families. It means recognizing and supporting the extended family networks and fictive kinship patterns we discussed earlier as legitimate forms of family that deserve the same kind of institutional support that nuclear families receive. Perhaps most importantly, solutions have to be developed with, rather than for, Black communities. The history we've covered shows what happens when policies affecting Black families are designed by people who don't understand or care about those families' actual experiences and needs. Real solutions will emerge from listening to Black mothers who are raising children in these circumstances, to Black fathers who are trying to stay involved despite systematic barriers, to Black young people who are navigating family formation, decisions in the context we've described. Community-based organizations that are actually embedded in Black neighborhoods and led by people from those communities need resources and power to develop and implement solutions that fit local conditions rather than having solutions imposed from outside by bureaucrats or politicians who have never experienced the challenges they're trying to address. We also need to confront the powerful interests that profit from or benefit politically from Black family instability, and that will resist meaningful change. This requires political organization and advocacy to counter the lobbying power of prison companies, predatory lenders, and other corporations that profit from poverty and family disruption. It requires building coalitions that can elect officials committed to real structural change rather than symbolic gestures. It requires sustained pressure and accountability to overcome the inertia of systems that have been functioning in destructive ways for so long that those ways seem normal and inevitable. None of this is easy, and none of it will happen quickly. The damage took 400 years to create. Healing it will take generations of sustained commitment to addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms. But the alternative is accepting that 73% statistic is permanent, accepting that Black families will continue to struggle with instability and its consequences indefinitely, accepting that the historical trauma we've documented will continue to shape and limit Black lives for generations to come. That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable morally, and it's not acceptable practically, because family instability contributes to so many other social problems that affect all of us, regardless of race. The 73% statistic is a challenge to American society to finally face what it has done to Black families across centuries, and to make a genuine, comprehensive commitment to repairing that damage. It's a call to move beyond the easy narratives about cultural dysfunction and personal responsibility to the harder work of dismantling systems of oppression and building systems of genuine support and opportunity. It's a demand for truth, for accountability, for investment, for structural change, and ultimately for justice, not just as an abstract ideal, but as concrete policies and practices that enable Black families to thrive rather than just survive. The question isn't whether we know what needs to be done. The history we've covered makes the answers clear enough. The question is whether we have the collective will and courage to actually do it, to see this through across the years and decades it will take, to prioritize healing this wound even when it's expensive and uncomfortable and requires confronting truths about American society that many would prefer to ignore. That's the challenge we face. That's what moving forward requires. And that's the only way that number, that 73%, ever changes.